Okay, in Chapter 10, we're going to talk about interviewing. So it's called Inquiry and Fraud Reports. And the objectives are to understand the interviewing process, discuss how to plan and conduct an interview, understand the nature of admission-seeking interviews, so when we're actually trying to get somebody to admit to the crime. We're going to talk about the different deceptions and lies used by perpetrators, types of honesty tests, and then ultimately how to prepare a fraud report once we're done with our investigation. So as we've talked about before, the interview is the most common technique used to investigate fraud. And that's because we spend a lot of our time talking to individuals to find out where this investigation should go. So when we show up and management hires us to conduct a fraud investigation, if, for example, the investigation surrounds missing inventory in the warehouse, then we're going to spend time talking to individuals to find out who had access to the warehouse, who was working at that time, right? What internal controls were in place, right? How do people get access to the warehouse? So you start your investigation by interviewing people. So you might talk to the warehouse manager, say, how do people check in and out of the warehouse? Right? Who was working at the time that we think the inventory went missing? Right? Now, as they give us answers, we're going to corroborate that with higher forms of evidence like time cards to show who was actually working on that night. But as this example shows, we spend a lot of our time interviewing people, and that helps us guide the direction of the fraud investigation. Now, we're not law enforcement, so we don't interrogate people. So most of the time, well, in fact, most of the time, we're not even interviewing the perpetrator. So we're just trying to gather as much information as we can. So these interviews are just question and answer sessions, just to gather information. We'll talk in a few minutes about what we do when we're actually trying to get somebody to admit guilt. But normally these interviews are fairly friendly, but they're structured. So when we go into an interview, we usually have a script, and we have a design of the information that we want to get from this particular person, this particular witness. And so it's not a free-form discussion. We come in, we talk to the person, we tell them, hey, I'm here to talk about the warehouse, personnel, the internal controls that you have in place. I have a list of questions that I need to ask. Can you give me 30 minutes? I hope that's okay, right? And then it's a structured conversation. We go through and we ask our questions. They said generally we have this written down, questions prepared. And then, as they answer, we'll have follow-up questions as well. But again, this is a structured conversation that we have with these individuals. And so it's a systematic questioning to gather knowledge about events, people, and potential evidence in the case. So consequently, we're going to use this information as to first establish the essential elements of the crime. And then that's going to help us develop the case and then figure out what evidence we need to gather. Right? So if we're talking to individuals, the warehouse manager, and they're telling us that these 3 individuals were working on the night of the theft, then now we know we can go look at the logs to see if they were indeed the ones that logged in. Right? We can look at the time cards to see if they were working at that time. Or we can cooperate with other forms of evidence. Perhaps we find out through gathering evidence that the warehouse manager was not being truthful, right? Then we go back and have more questions for him. But we always want to solicit the cooperation of the victims and the witnesses. And and we want to get them to agree to talk to us. And most of the time when we come in, in the initial investigation, we don't tell them that we're there to conduct a fraud investigation, unless they're victims of the fraud and they already know that that's why they've hired us, and so we'll tell them. But if we're just interviewing folks that don't know that fraud's occurred, then we wouldn't necessarily say we're conducting a fraud investigation. We would just say, we're here as auditors or consultants. We have some questions. Management's asked us to follow up on a few things. So if we get your help, that would be great, right? And most people don't question why auditors are in the building. I mean, they have to get their financial statement audited every year, and if they're somehow related to the EPA or that file their tax returns to the IRS, that they're going to see auditors on a regular basis. So it doesn't raise too many questions. And so, but as we gather information, about the personal backgrounds, and ultimately we can potentially gather information about motives of the witnesses and whether they're telling us the truth. So there's three types of interviews, and most of them are the first type, they're friendly. And the witness, we're just there asking them questions, as an auditor, as far as they know, and they go sort of beyond the normal expectation to help out. They're just trying to give us information. A lot of them are neutral, though. They're not really giving us extra information, but they're also not hostile. They just, as part of their job, they meet with the auditor. They give them the information. They're not involved in the crime. They don't suspect that there was a crime, and so they don't have anything to gain or lose from talking to us. Right? In those situations, we wouldn't necessarily question their motives or whether they're giving us truthful information. Now, of course, if something comes back later on that might lead us to believe that they were lying, based on what other interviewees said or based on evidence that we gathered, then we might come back, and then the nature of the interview might change. It may even turn hostile, which is the last type of interview. And when it says it's hostile, it doesn't mean that they're actually uncooperative or that they're being mean to us. It just means that we don't just assume that they're going to be truthful, right? That the information that they're going to give us may not be accurate. And that's because, like it says, is these hostile interviewees are often associated with the crime or the suspect in some way. And so when we go into an interview that we suspect to be hostile, and again, it doesn't mean that the person's going to be yelling at us or difficult to work with. In fact, it might be quite the opposite, that they are involved in the crime and they're trying to be as cooperative as they can because they suspect that we're investigating the crime and they don't want to cast any suspicions on themselves by getting upset or being hostile. They try to be overly friendly. But it would be a hostile interview because we would be concerned that they're not going to tell us the truth. So we're constantly going to be thinking about what they're telling us and whether that fits in with our description of events or our line of thinking related to this potential fraud. But the characteristics of a good interview, now obviously got to be sufficient length and depth. So when we go in, and if say it's a friendly or a neutral interview, we have a list of questions that we want to get. We can make an estimate of how much time we think it'll take, and I'll probably estimate a little bit more than what we really think, so that when we go in, we'll say, if we think it's going to take us 30 minutes, we might say, we need an hour of your time because we've got a list of questions. So we want to make sure that they have enough time, and we schedule in advance and have them sit down with us and give us enough time so that we can answer the questions, and we don't get cut short and we don't lose potential information because we didn't plan enough time for this interview. But we also want to focus on the pertinent information. Now, when we come in, we're going to have introductory questions like, how are you doing? How long have you worked here? Things like that. But we want to focus on, that's why it's important to have a script. And when you turn in your final project, your final individual project, that's the last thing you want to do is write the script that you would use if you were going to interview the perpetrator. Right? And we write these scripts so that we can focus on pertinent information. Like we said, it's not a free flow conversation. We're asking questions, and we have information that we're trying to glean from them. And like I said, it always should end on a positive note. And what I tended to do when I ended interviews as an auditor, I would tell them I'm likely going to come back if that's okay, because I knew that when I went up to write a report about the information that I had gathered, I knew that I was going to have additional questions. Right? You're thinking about things on the fly. You're writing things down. When you go to actually type it up in a report that somebody else can read, you oftentimes realize they didn't gather as much information as you needed because there's still some holes in the narrative as you start writing it up. So if you tell them, hey, I want to come back if that's okay and ask you a few more questions after I type this up, they almost always agree to do it. And then they're not surprised or become uncooperative when they see you again. Because again, you're sort of taking time out of their day. And so you want to continuously get them to cooperate with you. And you want to end on that positive note so that you can come back at any time should the need arise. You also want to conduct the interview as soon as possible after the event, like the fraudulent event. That's not always possible to do it immediately after because you may have been hired a year later to investigate this event. But to the extent that you can get it as close to the event as possible is the better. because it's less likely they're going to forget something, because witnesses forget. They're like Roger Clemens, they misremember things. So the less likely that you're going to get some bad information, the, the sooner you can do it after the event happened. Now, you clearly want to be as objective as possible. That's why you want to write out your questions in a script ahead of time, because you don't want the questions to sound condescending or biased. And so if you're writing out your questions and you realize that might be leading, or might be like, might interject bias into the system, because we don't want them to necessarily, some people just want to please us, and so they might think, well, they're here and I want them to think that I'm doing a good job, and so I'm going to give them information that may be not truthful. It makes me look better, or maybe it gets to what I think that they want to know. So the more objective that we can ask the questions, and the less biased that our questions are, the more likely to get good evidence from this potential witness. And then so that goes along with the last point, is endeavor to gather information in a fair and impartial manner. And that's why, if you've planned your interview ahead of time and you've developed a good script and you know exactly the questions that you want answers to, and you phrase those questions in an unbiased, an objective way, then you're going to gather that information that's likely to be fair and impartial. The characteristics of a good interviewer, it says first here is the outgoing personality, and that's somewhat true. You don't necessarily have to be an extrovert to be a good interviewer. With the outgoing personality, what that means is you have to be comfortable talking to people, and then and getting information that they may not want to give up. Right? So if it makes you nervous to be in an environment where you're asking sensitive questions, or questions that you think are going to make the person uncomfortable, then you may not make a good interviewer. So you have to be able to be relaxed, be able to put people at ease, like the third bullet point here says. You need to have a personality such that you're comfortable asking questions, even difficult questions, and you can ask them in a way that puts people at ease and allows them to respond in an impartial way. So like it says, outgoing personality is important, but it's more that you can't necessarily be an introvert. You have to be able to have a good way about you and asking questions, and that usually occurs with people who are a little more outgoing. Now, we don't want to interrupt respondents unnecessarily unless they're the perpetrator. Right? Normally, when we're just interviewing neutral or friendly witnesses, we want to gather as much information as we can. So the more we can let them talk, the more likely we're able to get the information that we want, because we don't always know the questions to ask. And so if you can say, can you walk me through this process of internal controls? And then give them the opportunity to tell you sort of everything they know about that internal control. It's going to be helpful. You don't want to interrupt them, mess up their train of thought, because that'll help you get as much information as possible. Now, clearly, if they start going on start talking about tangential things that aren't advancing the investigation, you want to somehow transition them back. Right? But normally, you don't interrupt, unless, like I said, it's the potential perpetrator, and you think they're lying to you. Because if they're lying to you and you're trying to get them to admit it, you don't want them to lie and tell you that they didn't do it, because they're going to get hardened in their position. And it's going to be less likely that they're going to be able to backtrack and then tell you the truth. So if they start saying, no, I didn't do it, I didn't take that inventory, even in light of the evidence that you showed me, say, I've got to stop you right there. I just want to reiterate the points that I made about the evidence that we have. We found the stolen inventory at your house, right? The warehouse manager said you're working at that time, so I can't let you continue to tell me this when all the other evidence tells me otherwise. And then you can even phrase it to them in ways such that, let's say that you're the boss and you have two employees that stole from you. One employee feels bad, comes in, tells you the truth, right? Says they're sorry, and wants to make things right. The other employee continues to lie to you, even in light of all the evidence. And so, which one of these individuals would you be more likely to want to help if you were the boss? Now, obviously, it's going to be the first one. So you can phrase, that type of, you can phrase it in that way, or a similar way, so that the person who you're interviewing, that you're trying to get to confess, doesn't continue to lie to you. Because eventually, not only are they going to have to do something uncomfortable, which is committing that they committed a crime, they're also then going to have to admit that they've been lying to you all along, which is going to be even harder to do. So you don't interrupt friendly and neutral interviewers. You sort of let them go unless they get tangential. But you do interrupt the perpetrator if you think they're lying, because you don't want them to get hardened in that lie and make it harder for them to then backtrack and tell you the truth. Because ultimately you're trying to get to that point where they're telling you the truth and they're confessing to the crime. Because what you want in your report, you want to have that signed statement that the person confessed. And that's going to be the end of the interview. And the sooner or the end of the investigation, as soon as you can get to that point, the better. So don't let them lie. Now, also display interest in the subject and what's being said. That's part of being outgoing. I mean, you want to, you're there to just get information, but to that person, they're new. You're new to them. They don't know why you're necessarily there. And so if you sound disinterested, they're less likely to give you the information that you need. Right? So you want to display interest and always sort of maintain that outgoing, sort of friendly, easy way about you so that people will continue to give you the information that you need. We've talked about before, one of the reasons why it's good to write out that script is because you want to be able to phrase the questions in a way that don't sound accusatory. Now, again, unless you're interviewing the perpetrator, and then you want to accuse them. But if you don't think the person's involved, or you don't know if they're involved, and you're just trying to gather information, you don't want to phrase the question such that it implies that you're accusing them of something that maybe they didn't do, because then they're less likely to want to continue the interview and give you the information that you need. And we've talked about demonstrating a lack of bias in your questions. So that's why it's important to write that script and make sure that your questions, because as you write the questions out, you can see this sounds too biased, this sounds accusatory, right? This sounds condescending. And then you can rewrite the questions so that when it comes time to ask the questions, you can do it in an unbiased manner. Now, obviously, being on time is important and attired professionally. You want them to feel like you're a professional, and that the time they're spending with you is important, and you can show that by being on time for interviews and dressing appropriately. They also want to feel like you've been fair to them, right? Even when you're interviewing the perpetrator, you want them to feel like, even though you're trying to get them to commit to a crime, that you're going to be fair. You're going to be fair and honest with them. And so that's part of being unbiased and getting the cooperation of the witness. Now, the thing to remember that if you look at the head of this slide, it's understanding reaction to a crisis. Now, this literally is a crisis, and it's for both sides. So the employer has found out now that one of their employees, their trusted employees, the bookkeeper for 15 years, has embezzled money from them. So this is going to be shocking. It's almost like a divorce. You find out that somebody's been unfaithful, and so there's going to be a range of emotions, not just for the employer, but also for the employee who's stealing. And so, and that's part of your job as a fraud investigator, is to be a bit of a therapist. So you have to understand how people respond and react to crises. The first stage in that is denial. So the employees who's stealing wants to deny that they're involved, and they also want to deny themselves that they're doing anything wrong, because it makes them, they feel bad, they feel guilty. So they want to deny that they're doing anything wrong, and they want to deny to their boss that they're doing anything wrong. Now the employer, the boss, is in denial because they found out now that this trusted employee has stole from them, and they find it hard to believe. They're just like, no, they would never do that. There must be some mistake. Maybe I was too hard on them. Like, something happened. They didn't really do this. And so that first stage is denial. Right? And so once you tell the boss, then the first stage that, yes, this is the employee we think's been stealing from you. This is the size of the scope of the theft, of the asset misappropriation. The boss's reaction might be to deny. Now that can't be the right person. There's no way they did it. I trust them completely. No, they never take vacation. They're not the most faithful employee. They would never do something like this. And so you want to help them get past that denial and really see the evidence that you have. And you want the individual to sort of get past that denial and actually tell you that, ultimately you want them to accept that they did this and that there's going to be some punishment related to that. Now, the second step is anger. So the boss, once he stops denying that this individual is the one that stole from him, then he's going to be angry, right? Just like I said, this is just like a divorce. So you find out that your significant other's been unfaithful to you, you're going to be angry, right? And you don't want to deal with the employer or the perpetrator in this stage either when they're angry, because it's going to be hard for them to think rationally, right, and move forward with the investigation. So, but that's part of your job as a therapist, as this fraud investigator, is to recognize that they're going to deny it, and then there's going to be some anger, right? And so it's important to work with that, get them to calm down, right? Don't be too hard edged in those situations. Just help them walk through the process and see it's going to be best if they calm down, right? And then think about this rationally and move forward. So give them some time to vent, but then you move forward that we're going to get past this anger. And it's not best to make any decisions during this anger period because you're going to make probably poor decisions. Then the third stage is sort of bargaining and rationalization. So that people are going to attempt to justify this dishonest act, right? So the perpetrator is going to say, well, that's where the rationalization is going to set in. I was going to pay it back. It's not. I didn't really do anything wrong. Other people in the organization do worse things. And they do this. Others have done the same thing I've done. It's not. I didn't really do anything. So they're going to try and bargain or rationalize that something happened. There's the same thing with the employer. They're going to think, well, maybe I did something wrong, right? Maybe this trusted employee, that I've known for all these years was embezzling from me because I failed to be a good boss, right? Maybe I did something that wasn't the right thing to do, and that I brought this on myself. Now, again, this bargaining rationalization stage is not a good place to be either, because you need to get the perpetrator to recognize that they did something wrong, and it's not something that everybody else is doing. It's not something that they're ever going to pay back, right? They were actually stealing, right? And you need the employer to recognize that this employee stole from them, and we just need to move forward with the investigation and just accept that and not try and rationalize the behavior. Then, so once you've gotten to the point, you've gotten past the anger and the rationalization, now you're like, oh gosh, I am a criminal. And now you're just depressed, right? And I've watched a lot of these interviews where they get the person to finally confess, and then they're in a state of depression, right? Or even before the acceptance, before they've actually said, yeah, I've done it, they reach this, I feel like I've been caught, and their mind's spinning, thinking, how am I going to tell my family? How am I going to tell my wife and kids that, I've been, my neighbors, that I've been, committed this criminal act? And so in that case, they're going to withdraw, they're going to lose interest. And that's what you see. They tend not to want to talk. They're all slumped over in the corner. Right? They're not trying to rationalize it. They're just got this sense of dread and disappointment and what's going to happen to me going forward. Right? And it's the same thing with the boss. It's like, well, now I've just trusted an employee. I'm going to have to fire him, try and recover the money. It's going to be difficult. I feel bad for their family. Right? I don't even know if I should try and recover the money, because this person was probably in desperate straits, and so now there's a sense of depression that this thing's happened to you. So again, you need to work through that, right? As the fraud investigator / therapist, you sort of recognize that they're going to be depressed, right? And give them some time for depression to sort of work itself through, because ultimately they're going to get past the depression and they're going to move to acceptance, which is, okay, I did it. I've accepted it now that I'm going to have to tell my family. The employer's like, I've accepted now that my trusted employee for all these years is stolen from me. I just want to move forward now and just resolve this and make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that there's somehow a way to recover some of these assets, right, that have been stolen. And this is when it's most helpful, right? Is when they've accepted it. This is when the perpetrator is most likely going to sign that statement saying that they did it, which is what, kind of the end of the investigation. And it's also going to be the best for the employer, for the boss, because now they know, like, this happened, I'm going to have to fire this employee, potentially bring criminal charges against him, but it's the right thing to do, and I just got to get past this and get my business moving forward again. So that's where acceptance sets in. So like it's important to understand the reaction to crisis that people are going to have, because like when you're interviewing the perpetrator, it could take you a couple of hours to get this out of them, of continuing to show them the evidence, and they're going to cycle through the these emotions. So they may not get acceptance right away. Maybe they deny it and they get angry, then they deny it again, then they rationalize it, right? Then they get angry again, and then they get depressed. So they could flip back and forth, and it's just important as the interviewer that you recognize this, that they're going to be working through ranges of emotions as you accuse them of something that they're going to have to admit to themselves is criminal, because they've been rationalizing all along, and now they're going to have to come to the full realization that I can't rationalize this anymore. I've been caught, and I am a criminal, and I'm going to have to tell my family and my friends that this is what happened, that I'm losing my job and potentially going to go to jail. Right? So just realize that this is a crisis for both the employer and the employee, and there's going to be a lot of emotions that go on, and the better you are at recognizing these stages, the better you're going to be at conducting the interview and getting to the point, getting to acceptance and where you need to be. And it takes time, and it's okay to take some time in the interview for the person to get to acceptance, and then finally, being able to sign that statement. It's okay for the employer to be upset and then be angry and then rationalize and then be depressed, but help them work through it as well, right? Because you want them to accept that, yes, this employee is stolen from me, and I need to do the best thing now for my company going forward. So knowing that that's potentially going to happen, right, in interviews, it's important that you plan it. Right? And you follow a plan or an outline to meet your objective, and that's what we're going to do for our individual project. Is we're going to write that interview script so that you're planned, so that if you had to do that interview, you would know how to do it. You want to review all the documentation. It's like preparing for a test. You want to go through the book, read the text again. Answer sample questions, so you're prepared when you're in there, right? And that's when you go into the interview, you want to have your questions written out, all of your document. All of your evidence and documentation, inside and out, so that like if you're trying to interview the perpetrator and trying to get them to confess, and they start lying to you, you can't second guess yourself and think, well, maybe my evidence isn't as solid as I thought. Maybe did that time card really have their name on it? I mean, you start questioning yourself because they're going to deny and they're going to lie. So you have to have all the evidence, in your mind cold, so that you're best able to get the information you need out of employees, and also recognize if these people you're interviewing are not being truthful with you, right? Because you will have, what's on those documents, what evidence you've gathered. It's best to conduct the interviews at the interviewee's office. Even it says except for hostile interviewees. It is helpful for you to control the environment for the hostile interviewers or interviewees, but at the same time, you can control the environment at their location as well. But to be able to do this interview, unless you think it's going to be hostile, you set up an appointment, give yourself plenty of time. If it's hostile and you want to interview the perpetrator, you might not want to give them a lot of time. So you want to tell your boss, hey, I'm going to interview this person, when I come in, I'm going to interview them first thing in the morning. I don't want to give them a heads up because I don't want them to potentially hide evidence or give them time to think about it and develop a defense, a lie to cover this up. So at the hostile interview, or somebody that you think is potentially involved in the crime, you probably won't give them a lot of advance notice. But for most interviewers, interviewees, for most witnesses, you just want to ask, hey, I need to give, I'm going to need 30 minutes of your time. When's a good time that I can conduct this interview? And let them give you a time so that you're not rushed, and that it allows a sufficient amount of time to get this interview done and get all the relevant information that you need. Now, obviously, your demeanor is important, right? Just like we talked about, you need to be able to put people at ease. You need to be calm. You need to be professional. And it helps to be fairly, a little bit outgoing so that people feel comfortable with you. So again, be efficient, be courteous, be polite, and be careful with your language. And the way you do that is by running through this interview in your mind, developing that script and running it through in your mind a few times before you go in there. Right? And obviously, don't be unbiased, don't be condescending. So don't talk down to the person. You always want to talk up to them, right, and imply that, hey, you know more than I do. What can you tell me about this, right? What can you tell me about the internal controls here? And this is your business. What can you tell me? And then the language. You want to use short, clear questions. And you generally want to avoid yes and no questions. You want to, unless you're talking to the perpetrator, then you want to get yes or no. Did you do this? Type questions. But generally, you're trying to find out information. So you don't want to ask questions where it's not like you want to say, "Do you have good internal controls here?" Yes. You want to say, "Now I understand that you have barriers to entry to your warehouse. Can you explain some of those barriers to entries and how an employee checks into the warehouse?" Right. So you want to ask short, confined questions to one topic that the person can easily understand and respond to. And it's okay to give them time to respond. You can give them a little pause, and if they're thinking about it, you don't have to jump in with another question. You can even have some awkward silence there because you're trying to gather as much information as you can. As they think about it, maybe their first inclination is to not provide you with much information, but if you kind of give them that awkward pause for a while, they'll continue talking and continue to get more information that might be useful to you. But it's important, obviously, that you maintain control of the interview. So they start getting off topic. That's part of being a good interview is bringing them back, right? Don't let them dictate what you talk about. And that's why it's so good to have a script and have it written out exactly the piece of information that you need and the follow-up questions that you potentially want to ask, because that's going to help you. The better prepared you are, the more likely you are to be in control of the interview and get all the information that you need so you don't have to come back. So the types of questions. And when you write your individual project, you want to write these questions out in your script. So you have introductory questions. So you might want to write introductory at the top and then have some questions. And introductory questions, a lot of them are just ritualistic. It's just, how are you? That just helps put people at ease, right? People know that they may not care how you are, you don't care how they are, but that's just how you start conversations. How are you doing today? And it'll help put them at ease because, like, oh, this person's got good interpersonal skills. They're asking me how I am. Maybe you talk, briefly about how long they worked at the organization, and maybe you know somebody in common. You talk about that. So you have some introductory questions that'll help sort of set the stage and put them at ease. It's also helpful during that introductory phase to observe their demeanor, because if they're friendly, pretty laid back, not overly animated, and then when you start asking them specific questions about the potential case. You sort of baseline their behavior on introductory questions. So then if their behavior changes, so now they become short, they become terse with you, they fold their arms, they're looking towards the door, and you're saying, okay, this person no longer wants to be here. Right? And they start looking at their watch consistently, and you're saying, this person's uncomfortable, they don't want to be here. And so if you sort of baseline their behavior on introductory questions, then as you ask more sensitive questions, you can see if their behavior changes. But like if they fold their arms when they get there and they don't appear to want to talk to you even during introductory questions, if that's how they are as you're asking more sensitive questions, it wouldn't necessarily mean anything that they're even more uncomfortable during these sensitive questions. So you want to get a baseline how they're feeling with their introductory questions and how they normally respond to non-threatening questions. Then you get right into your informational questions. And this is where you're right on script, asking them questions about the time the fraud occurred. Question about internal controls, question about who could potentially be involved, etc. And you've got your whole list of questions. Then there's some assessment questions that you can ask to see, to assess how they're doing and what their state of mind is. And then you close, just thank you. Can I meet with you again if I have more questions? Type, just regular closing questions. And like I said, you want to close on that positive note. Thank them for spending the time with you. Let them feel good that they did a good thing by talking to you. Be that outgoing personality that makes them feel good about themselves and the time they spent. Now, of course, you wouldn't close the interview if you're interviewing the perpetrator and you're trying to get them to confess. Now, like we said, under the admission-seeking questions, now, like all the other rules are thrown out. You want to ask short, direct questions, even yes or no questions. You want to cut them off if they lie, right? You're going to become less friendly and personable. Not to the point of being mean, but you need to maintain control of that interview and not let them talk their way out of it. So if they start talking about other things, start giving you explanations that don't make sense, and the way that they don't make sense is that you've studied the evidence cold before you got in there. So if they start telling you things that don't jive with what you know, you immediately recognize it, and you can stop them, because, like you said, we don't want them. We want to stop them in lies immediately so that they don't get hardened in that lie. Because, like we said, if they have to go back then, and ultimately we need them to confess, and if they also have to confess to lying, then it's going to be doubly hard to get them to admit it. Right? So there's these different types of questions that we follow in a series. Then it's also important to just as the therapist that you are, as the fraud investigator, to understand elements of conversation. Because most of the elements, if you look here at these bullet points that we're working on, are as informational exchange. So we're just asking people questions, and they're giving us information. Right? It's like a neutral or friendly witness, and you're just trying to gather information from them. But when you interview the perpetrator, there's going to be potentially some other elements of conversation that factor in, and that could be persuasive. So they're trying to give you information and trying to persuade you to believe their story, that they're not involved in this crime. So they're not just exchanging, you're not just exchanging information. They're saying, I swear, you can talk to my pastor. They know that I would never do something like this. So they're not just trying to give information to you, they're trying to persuade you to their side. Right? Then there's, you might want to step in with some therapeutic conversation, therapy, where you're saying, look, I understand, that it would be hard for somebody in your position who had these unexpected medical bills, who, needed the money, just to avoid going into debt because of these bills. I understand how a person in your situation could really be in a bind and be tempted to steal from the employer. So you're being somewhat therapeutic because you want them to understand that you understand their situation, that you're not necessarily judging them, judging their motives or their character. You just need them to confess to what they did. Right? So there's therapeutic sort of conversations, and that's pretty common. And when you're interviewing the perpetrator, is because you want this experience to be cathartic for them, and so they feel better about telling you the truth versus continuing to lie, and they get that guilt off their chest. Right? And then some elements of conversation are expressive, so they're actually trying to express to you, this is how I'm feeling. I want you to understand that. And then some of it's just ritualistic. Like if you ask somebody how they're doing, they say fine. You're not exchanging necessarily information. It's not somebody that you care about. It's just that that's just ritualistically. That's what you do when you start a conversation. That's common to elements of the conversation. It's important to know, like as the therapist, what would cause people to not want to tell you the truth or to not give you all the information that you need. Well, one is community demands for time. That's why we want to plan the interview with enough time that they don't have to rush out, right? Because we have an agenda that we want to get to, and we want to get information from them, and so we want to make sure they have enough time to give it to us. The other reason why they may not tell us is their ego's threatened. They don't want to, and in this case, they don't want to admit that they're a criminal. Right? That's going to make them feel bad. Right? So having to say something that makes them, less in your eyes is difficult for them, right? So we need to help them, like therapeutically help them feel like, yeah, I understand this is difficult for you, but I also understand how somebody in your position could have gotten in this position. Some of the things that another inhibitor to communication is etiquette. So that's when, and maybe that you're interviewing a coworker, and they suspect that maybe they're, this other employee that they work with is involved in the fraud, but they don't want to say anything because they feel like that's poor form to rat out, a coworker. And so maybe they just feel like that's not something it's socially, awkward to tell this person that I don't know that my friend is potentially committing fraud. Right? So maybe for etiquette reasons, they just don't feel like, hey, I don't want to squeal on a friend, I don't want to rat somebody out. And so that's going to inhibit you getting the information that you need. And as long as you know that, hey, this person's friends with the coworker, they might feel some, it just feels like it's inappropriate for me to talk about them in a bad way. Sort of let them know that it's best if they can tell you the truth. It's going to be best for them and the individual. Sometimes it's traumatic, right? I mean, getting your ego threatened is traumatic, and you don't want to have that trauma in your life. You want to continue to believe that you're this honest person and you're going to pay the money back, right? And because you recognize that once you start to confess this, and you realize that they know that that you're involved based on the evidence that they're showing you, then you're going to go through these, like we talked about, these range of emotions, and that's traumatic, and you don't want to do that. So that inhibits conversation. So to the extent that you can make them feel like this isn't going to be that traumatic of an event, you're going to confess, you're going to feel much better about it, and we're going to be able to move forward. Sometimes they forget, so it's not that anybody's lying to you. It's just that's why we want to interview people as closely to the event as possible, because witnesses forget things. And the next one is chronological confusion. That's similar to forgetting. They just get things out of order. They didn't forget something happened. They just forgot what day it happened. They think something happened before that actually happened after. That's just part of our memories fade over time. And so those are inhibitors to communication as well, is forgetting. And so that's why when you go in as the interviewer, if it's been a while, you can say, let me walk you through the series of events to help you refresh your memory so that you don't forget. You can remember the scenario that played out. So let me tell you what some other witnesses have said. Let me explain to you, like I said, the chronology of events here so that they get it right. Sometimes it's inferential confusion. So they may infer the motives of somebody that aren't really the motives. So they may infer what your motives are for asking the questions and try and answer those, in a way that they think you want to hear versus actually telling you the truth. So sometimes there's inferential confusion, like the witness is inferring things that they shouldn't. And sometimes just unconscious behavior. We unconsciously don't want to share information with somebody for some reason or another. The things that facilitate communication one is fulfilling expectations. So if you've gone in as the interviewer and say, hey, I need to get information about internal controls, they're like, oh, okay, that's great. We're talking about internal controls. I know that's what you need as your auditor. I'm just trying to help you do your job. And so that facilitates communication, right? If you had said, I want to talk about internal controls, then you start talking about their personal life, and they might be like, what's this? Why are we talking about this, right? So to the extent that you can tell them what you want to get out of it, they're more likely to give you that information. Recognition. So, if we recognize people for doing the right thing, if whatever, giving them a pat on the back, saying, I'm really good. I'm really glad you talked to me, right? Providing any type of recognition helps a person want to give information. Altruistic appeals are sort of, that happens in church, like if the priest is trying to get you to confess, confession, you're doing the right thing, it's God will be happy with you, if you do this. So there's altruistic appeals that make people feel like they're doing the right thing, and that oftentimes facilitates them giving you information. Sympathetic, right? So if they're sympathetic with you or you're sympathetic with them, and they feel like you understand each other, then they're more likely to give you information. That facilitates communication. A new experience. Sometimes just as employees are working with the same people, there's an opportunity to talk to somebody new in the office, somebody new and exciting who maybe came down from New York to come talk to you about this, about your company and what you do, and that's exciting for them, and that makes them want to talk. And that's not always the case, but that can be the case. Catharsis. That's what we're hoping with when we're interviewing the perpetrator, is that this is going to be a cathartic experience for them, and they're going to feel better ultimately when they confess. Because they feel guilty, they felt guilty during the whole time they've been committing the fraud. And so if we can get them past that anger, rationalization, depression phase, and get them into acceptance, and they're going to be, I feel so much better now that I told somebody. Right? So catharsis is another way to facilitate communication. And that's what you want to do, is you want to set this up so that the perpetrator feels like it's going to be a cathartic experience for them to get it off their chest. And that'll facilitate communication. So to the extent that you can get them in that frame of mind is a good way to get the information you need. And then the need for meaning. That's more like a church type thing where you're talking to your priest, and why did this bad thing happen to me? And then the priest will say, you're going to grow from it, right? You're going to learn from this. So sometimes people want to give you information because they want it to make sense somehow in the broader scheme of things. And to the extent, like I said, this isn't so much a fraud investigation, but it could be. I mean, to the extent that you can help somebody feel like their actions fit into some broader picture that makes the world make sense, that life makes sense, then they're more likely to share information with you. And then, of course, intrinsic rewards. I mean, if you want to get somebody to blow the whistle, you pay them, right? So having whistleblower provisions and rewarding people for providing information that's useful for fraud investigators is also a facilitator of communication. So what about the actual mechanics of the interview? So when you go in and do the interview, well, obviously you want to make physical contact. That doesn't mean you go in and give them a hug. It's you go in, you shake their hand, and maybe touch their shoulder and say, "It's good. I'm glad that you could come in and talk to me. This is I just need 30 minutes of your time. It'll help me out a lot, right?" So making that physical contact is something it's ritualistic, but it sort of helps put the person at ease. Right? And then we talked about establishing the purpose of the interview. I came here to talk about internal controls around your warehouse. It's probably going to take about 30 minutes. I got about 15 questions to ask if that's okay. Right? That's going to facilitate communication. They want to fulfill your expectation. They're going to give you the information that you need. Now, clearly, we don't want to interview more than one person at a time. If we interview two people, and they might be reluctant to give up information, they might think, well, what's that person going to think about me if I tell them that I think a coworker is involved in a potential crime. So interviewing multiple people at the same time can cause problems. It's better to interview one person at a time because they're more likely to be candid with you in that setting. And related to that, you want to conduct the interview in private. So you want to do it in an office where people can't hear. You don't want to be sitting in a cube where other people can hear you talking. So even though you're only interviewing one person, other people can hear. So that person feels inhibited in giving up information. Obviously talking about non-sensitive questions. So we want to talk about questions that's why we want to write the scripts, is we want to ask questions in the least sensitive way possible, right? To feel like they're just giving you information. They're not squealing about a coworker. They're not necessarily saying bad things about themselves. That the internal control is not working. I mean, you just want to ask the questions in the least sensitive way possible. And then we talked about get that commitment for assistance. So so setting up the interview ahead of time commits them to assist you, right? Giving them enough time, springing on them. Then when you get there saying, I planned 30 minutes, it shouldn't take that long. Hope it's okay. At the end of the interview saying, hey, can I meet with you again? So getting that commitment for assistance and continuous agreement to help is a good part of the interview. It talks about establishing a transitional statement. That's important too, because you're going to be conducting your interview. You got your introductory questions, ask them how they are, how long they've worked there, and then transitioning. And you could even tell them, I want to transition out of my questions about internal controls, if that's okay. Right? And then that helps them see that you are following a script, that you do have a plan, right? And then if they start going off on tangents, you transition back to it's interesting we're talking about your kids. I want to get back to I had that original question about internal controls. If we can get back to that, if that's okay. Right? So it helps get continuous agreement, transitions them back, right? It maintains control of the interview. You don't want to invade their body space either. I mean, each culture has a body space, sort of a normal space between you when you discuss things, when you conduct an interview. So you don't want to be too close to them. You don't want to be too far away. Right? You want to be in sort of that sweet spot, maybe sitting behind a desk. So you originally, when you came in, you made the physical contact, but then you separated and you maintain the normal body space. It's also important in a fraud interview that you not get too close to them, because if you're a male and you're bigger than that person and that you get too close to them, they may feel like, hey, I'm feeling threatened. I'm under duress, right? So they give you information, but then they subsequently say that I only gave that information. I only confessed because the person was intimidating me. They were right in my face, and I felt duress. So I just wanted to get out of there. So I told them what they wanted to hear, right? And you don't want that, and that's going to potentially make your the statement that you got them to sign, inadmissible in court or cast doubt about their statement. So just maintain the appropriate body space, that you're not too close or even too far away. They said you made the physical contact when you shook hands when you came in the room, and then you sat a good distance apart, a normal distance apart, and then you conducted a non-sensitive and sort of dispassionate interview. the questioning sequence, right? So you start with general, and then you get specific. So generally, can you tell me, how the warehouse works? Like, how does one get into the warehouse, right? And then they talk about this. Now, specifically, what happens if they type in the wrong code, right? What would happen then, right? What would happen if they use somebody else's password, right? So you start off broadly, and then you move to specifics, and it's all based on your script. At the same time, you want to take notes, and so it's important to tell the interviewee, I'm going to take some notes if that's okay. I've got a list of questions that I want to ask, and I'm going to take some notes if that's okay. And that makes them feel better because they feel like they're writing the information down. They're not going to have to ask me for it again. It's sort of worse if you don't tell them you're going to take notes, and all of a sudden you spring it on them in the middle. You start, I need to write this stuff down, and they might get nervous, like, why are they writing this down? But if you tell them up front, hey, I've got a list of questions here written out, and I'm also going to take some notes if that's okay, then that's going to be fine. It mentions it's particularly helpful if you get subpoenaed, right? And you've got your notes, right? And notes are better than trying to rely on your memory. So that's important. You could potentially not only take notes but also videotape it. But again, you want to get their approval to videotape it because they might be nervous. Or do an audio tape. But having that audio tape, especially if you get into court and the witness either forgot or if they they're lying, if you have your notes and putting in an audio or videotape, you can go to the tape, and sometimes the judge will ask for that. Well, if you have that taped, I'd like to get a transcript of the tape. Right? And then during the course of the interview, we're going to be observing their reactions. So, like I said, during that introductory phase, maybe they're not agitated and they're being really friendly and they're not using their hands, they're not being too animated. But then, as you start asking sensitive questions, they start getting more animated. Then you might think, okay, well, something's going on now, right? And that's what good interviewers recognize changes in behavior and what that might be saying about the interview. But during this interview, you want to formulate, a theme and have your questions written out that aren't going to elicit strong emotional reactions, right? Because you don't want to come in there, like Tom Cruise, and say you can't handle the truth, and things that are going to bring emotional reactions. What you want, because they said we're not in court, we're not interrogating the person, we can't threaten them with jail time or anything else. We want them to voluntarily tell us that they're involved in a crime, and so that takes asking questions dispassionately that aren't going to make strong emotional reactions, that aren't going to get you in that cycle of depression and everything. That can easily work through that and get to them telling you the truth. But even if it's a friendly or neutral interview, you don't want to ask questions that are going to make strong emotional reactions. You just want to maintain the facts and just get the information that you went into the interview to get. And then we talked about transitioning, right? So once you've had those introductory questions, then it's okay. Say, I'd like to transition now to the meat of the interview here, where I have these questions about internal controls, if that's okay. Now, there's potential for volatile interviews. And if there's close friends or suspects or co-conspirators, that's similar to interviewing the perpetrator, that they could potentially get upset and get hostile. So you just got to be aware that maybe I'm not interviewing the suspect themselves, but I'm interviewing a coworker that's that they spend a lot of time with, and I got to be sensitive to the fact that they may be concerned that I'm asking sensitive questions about their friend, and their friend could get in trouble, right? That could turn volatile. So again, it comes back to being sensitive and understanding who you're talking to, and maintaining that spirit of cooperativeness and continuous agreement. And like we said, we want to be able to detect patterns of deception. And then this is really hard. I mean, it's hard as you're learning the interview process, how to be a good interviewer. Without a lot of experience, you're not necessarily going to be good at detecting deception. But as you work and hone your skills as an interviewer, you start to know what to look for when people stop looking you in the eye, right? And when they become terse. when they fold their arms, when they turn towards the door. As you start to notice these cues that they're getting uncomfortable, right? And it may be that they become excessively friendly. So they were sort of neutral before, but then you start asking questions that might indicate that they're involved in some criminal activity. Then they become extremely friendly, right? And they start saying things like, "Oh, I would never lie to you. Trust me. You can ask anybody that I know. You can talk to my pastor. He would tell you I never lie." So usually when people are making, appeals to higher authorities, like, I swear to God, I would never do this. You can ask anybody. My friends know I would never do this. Go talk to them. Right? Those are not the types of things that people who are being honest say. People who are being honest and they're not involved get upset when you continue to tell them that they're involved. They don't say things like, "I'm not lying," because that implies that they were lying, but now they're not, right? They say, "No, I did not do that." The more you say it, the more you accuse them, the more they say, "I did not do it." But as they start making these oaths, to a higher power, start referring you to others and trying to deflect this accusation, that's evidence. That's not necessarily evidence, but it's a sign that maybe they're being a little bit deceptive and not necessarily telling you the truth. And as you get better at recognizing these cues, you become a better and better interviewer. Now it says here that there's verbal and nonverbal cues. Now most of the time, our verbal cues are what we're going after. We hear these phrases like 90% of conversation is nonverbal. That's not necessarily the case. Your best evidence is going to come from what they actually say, not what they do, not the way they behave in the interview. The best, most solid evidence is what they actually say. But that doesn't mean that during the course of the interview, we're not observing how they're behaving, because their behavior it might suggest, and like sometimes it's opposite to what we think. Like generally, if somebody's telling the truth and you keep accusing them, like we said, that you get upset. They get upset with you and continue to get upset. But if you're accusing them of something and they're not getting upset and they're just like, "Oh, no," because first of all, they're not upset because they're being accused of something that they did, so they know they did it, so they're not necessarily offended that you saying they're doing it, and they're trying to deflect attention away from themselves and trying to make themselves like a sympathetic character, so they're actually trying to be friendlier to you, and that's when that's when you get in a situation like, "No, you can go talk to my friend. You want me to get him right now?" Because he'll tell you that I wasn't involved in this. So when they start saying things like that and trying to become overly friendly, oftentimes that's a sign that they are being deceptive, right? When they don't get offended when you accuse them of something. And so it mentions here that sometimes increased tensions it does increase the tension because you're accusing them of something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get upset or become hostile. But what they will become is oftentimes less forthcoming in their responses and less compelling in their stories. So if you're trying to ask them, okay, what happened, between 10 p.m. and midnight when you were working in the warehouse, that's when, when the new employee came in at, after your shift, they noticed the inventory was missing. So then they can tell you everything that happened, up till 10 o'clock. And then from 10 to midnight, they're saying, "Well, I'm not really sure I can't remember what I did. I think maybe I got some coffee and, I talked to Fred for a little while. And then it became midnight, and then I left, and when I got in my car, I went right to Circle K. I bought some Slim Jims because I was hungry. Then they can remember everything after that. Right? So if they become less forthcoming and they become less clear and their storytelling becomes more vague, during the fraud period, for example, that's when you start thinking, okay, maybe they're not telling me the truth. Right? It says fewer ordinary imperfections. So that could be if they've rehearsed a story and they're not like they're sort of telling you this rehearsed story, and they just keep repeating the same thing. It might make you a little bit suspicious as well. But that's more if they came into the interview knowing that they were going to be confused of something, so they've got a story to tell, and then they don't ever deviate from that story. Most of the time when people are telling a spontaneous story and remembering what happened, sometimes there's some ordinary imperfections. Like, "Oh, no, wait a minute, that's not actually what I did. I did this first and then I did that." Yeah, that's right. right? And then that's more of a common way of telling the story. But usually when you do that, you're telling a compelling story. You're walking through the whole time frame of events. If they can't remember the time frame of events, or they remembered exactly how it happened, and there's no deviation or imperfections in their story, then you'd be suspicious. So, like I said, there's not really one thing. It's sort of a pattern of things that would lead you to believe that somebody's being deceptive. So that's interviewing. The other thing that you can do as a fraud investigator, and we've talked about this, is like when you hire somebody, you give them a pencil and paper test to see if they're likely to be honest, if they're an honest person. So there's honesty testing out there like the FBI gives. And they usually ask questions in a series, same type of questions, same question in several different ways, and to see if you're consistent in how you respond. So people who are dishonest, like especially when they're trying to get a job, they'll respond in how they think the employer wants them to respond, and so they may not answer the same question the same way all the time. Especially if they rephrase the question and give you different alternatives. And so there's honesty testing. Now, you don't usually give honesty paper and pencil tests to potential perpetrators. That's more like when you're interviewing people just to see if you're going to get an honest person. There's graphology, which is more like handwriting and detecting stress and that type of thing, honesty. And then there's polygraphs. And polygraphs are used in fraud investigations. But the evidence that you get from a polygraph, like if somebody passes a polygraph test, that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't involved. And if they didn't pass it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are involved. It just means they didn't pass the polygraph or that they passed it. And so because some people are pathological liars, they can lie and not feel bad about it. They can pass polygraphs even when they're lying because they don't feel any stress and it doesn't get picked up in a polygraph. Some people are nervous, just being hooked up to the machine and have asked questions makes them nervous, and so they don't pass polygraph tests even when they're telling the truth. That's why the evidence is not that's why you can't use a polygraph as evidence in case. You can't submit it as evidence in the case. Well, they passed the polygraph test, or they didn't pass it, so they must be involved. Now, the court's not going to accept that. So the question is, why do they do polygraphs? Well, you do polygraphs to eliminate people as suspects in the beginning. You don't eliminate them permanently because you're going to continue to conduct the investigation, and the investigation may bring you back to that person. But if you don't know who did it, especially law enforcement, they'll oftentimes give people polygraphs. The most logical people polygraph test, and the people who pass, they put them aside for them, and they investigate people who don't pass. Right? But then again, the investigation is going to lead, and maybe the person that passed the test was a pathological liar and didn't have any problems, and then the investigator brought it back to them. But usually you use a polygraph to rule people out in the initial stages of an investigation so that you can be more efficient and who's more likely to be involved. It's like what happens oftentimes in if a child's been abducted, they polygraph the family members first. Just at an ordinary course of business, a criminologist will. And that's because most of the time a family member is involved when a child's been abducted. And so they interview the most obvious people first so that they can decide who to focus their investigation on initially. But then as they gather evidence, the investigation is going to take them, back to that person who didn't pass the polygraph test or potentially to somebody else, but it helps eliminate suspects in the beginning. That's helpful. And the last thing that we do is we have to prepare a fraud report. So we've got the perpetrator, we're a really good interviewer, we got them to confess, we get them to sign a statement to everything that they did, right? They sign it, and then we need to write up our findings. So we have to write a report. The report we want it to be as objective as possible, and by do that we base it solely in facts, and we don't bias it with our own opinions. And that's going to make a fraud report more convincing and more compelling. So if we just state the facts in our report saying we were hired to do this, to look for the missing inventory, to figure out who potentially took the inventory. We conducted these interviews. This is what these people said. Right? We gathered this evidence. We found this time card to show that this employee was working at the time. We found the inventory at that employee's home address. Right? The employee subsequently confessed and wrote this statement, right? And then if you're hired to, you make recommendations to fix whatever internal controls were potentially violated so that the company can take corrective actions and not fall prey to this potential fraud scheme again, right? But the report is not, it's not going to say, well, we couldn't prove it, but we still think this, right? Or we asked these questions, but then the questions sound like they were biased or accusatory. And so when we write that report, it's important that we conducted the interview in an objective and unbiased way, so that comes out in the fraud report, right? And say we come to our report is that we don't know who did it, right? So we've come to the end, we've put corrective actions in place to make sure the inventory doesn't get stolen again, but maybe we had evidence that we think one person did it, maybe we think Jane Doe did it, but if we don't have the evidence and she didn't confess, then we don't imply in the report that they're guilty. We just say, this is the evidence that we gathered, this is what the person said, right? Eventually we concluded the investigation and we made these recommendations. Right? And that's going to come across as being the most objective and most factual. Just to give an example, like there's a recent case with Tom Brady, in the Deflategate situation. And when that report from the investigator went to court, the judge found that it was biased, and it wasn't, everything that happened wasn't based on the facts and the findings. They were drawing conclusions that maybe they should not have, or that the facts didn't support. And so essentially sided with Tom Brady, the judge did, because he didn't find the report to be unbiased, and he felt like they read too much into the evidence, and that it was biased in favor of one outcome. So that's why it's important to get these fraud reports right, and don't overstate the evidence that you have, right? Don't try and reach conclusions that you can't support just to appear that you're a good fraud investigator. But your findings should just be, here's what we were hired to do, here are the interviews that we conducted, here's the evidence that we gathered, right? If the person confessed, here's the signed statement, right? And then here's recommendations for corrective action. If they don't confess, here's what we found, right? Nobody confessed to the case, but this is the conclusion based on the evidence that we have, and these are the corrective courses of action. Right? And if you do that, and it's hard. I mean, they said that the thing that we spend most of the time doing in our fraud investigation is interviewing, right? And then the thing that we really take away from the fraud investigation is the report. And again, that's all communication. So it's either verbal communication through interviewing or written communication and writing the report. But it's all communication. And so we have to be good communicators in a fraud investigation, and be unbiased in our interviews, and then be unbiased in our report findings. And to the extent that the courts, because remember our fraud report is potentially going to be, it's forensic accounting, it's potentially going to wind up in court, we need the judge to believe us that we were unbiased and we only reach conclusions that we can support with the evidence that we gather. And if we do that, we'll be in pretty good shape. But that's why it's so important and so vital if you're going to get in this profession, is to be a good communicator. Not just a good verbal communicator, but a good written communicator as well.